This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for watching this week's NC Spin. On this week's show, we're going to ask whether our legislative leaders may have outsmarted themselves in their attempts to elect Republican judges. We move on to major changes in our state's Medicaid program, including what might be the most expensive contracts ever awarded in North Carolina history. And if there's time, we want to bring you up to date on whether or not we need legislation to implement online sales tax collections. But you can be sure we won't sign off until we ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of the panel, let's introduce this week's analysts. They include Peg O'Connell, political analyst and lobbyist, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon, senior political analyst and columnist, and Anna Beavon Gravely, political analyst. We're going to begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
Let's get to it. Our legislative leadership clearly wants more Republican judges, but they may have outfoxed themselves. The 2018 judicial elections feature one Supreme Court race in which Justice Barbara Jackson is going to be facing Democrat Anita Earls. Just before the filing deadline, however, Chris Anglin, who had recently changed his party affiliation from Democrat to Republican, filed for the seat. Well, legislators quickly passed a bill saying that if a candidate had not changed affiliation more than 90 days before filing, his or her name on the ballot would not have a party identification. Well, Anglin took him to court. A judge ruled this past week that the hastily passed provision violated Anglin's constitutional rights and overturned the law. Anna Beavon. Some of us still remember back in the elections, I think it was 2016, when lawmakers tried to protect Justice Bob Edmonds' seat through a judicial retention vote instead of facing a candidate. Edmonds lost, many believe because of all the negative publicity. Could we be looking at the same scenario with Justice Jackson in 2018?
Well, anytime you have legislative action before a judicial race, there are going to be a lot of similarities drawn. However, there's one major difference. This is 2018 and that was 2016. 2016 was a presidential year. There were lots of other things on the ballot. You had the president, governor, Senate, Congress, and then you got to the Supreme Court race. In this, we have statewide amendments with the expressed purpose of turning out votes, and then the judicial race. And when we have very little competition for voters' attentions, I think it might end up working well for Justice Jackson.
Well, okay, so let's look at this. The judge said, Judge Becky Holt, I think her name was, that the ballot must list Anglin as a Republican. Well, the legislature filed an appeal to this. How's this going to play out, Peg? You're our lawyer.
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball. I think you need a magician on this to know how it's going to all turn out. But I think the judge was right. You know, my lawyer friends are going to cringe when I say this, but what the legislature did in that specific case is a combination of bill of attainder and an ex post facto law, even though those are...
I was thinking that very thing, weren't you?
Exactly. Those are criminal things. They're prohibited in the Constitution, but they singled out one person, and then somebody else sort of got swept into it. And they did it after the fact. If they needed people to register in their party 90 days before, they should have thought of that before.
Like I said earlier, they may have outsmarted themselves. All right. The judge said, Chris, that England was likely to prevail in a court of law when issuing the injunction. What's the appeal all about?
Well, the appeal is the General Assembly still wants him to run as an unaffiliated voter because they know the odds are if there are 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat in a statewide election, the odds are the Democrat has a built-in advantage. Let's remember, we haven't talked yet about why this happened. This happened normally if there's a candidate who switches his or her registration at the last minute, there's a party primary to figure out who represents the party. I think it's pretty clear if there had been a party, Justice Jackson, a primary, would have won and we'd had 2 candidates on the ballot. But the General Assembly, the Republican General Assembly, eliminated the primary. By doing that, they opened the door under the current rules of our elections for this to happen. Now this happened, and they want to go back and say, oops, we want to now change the rules because we don't like what happened. This actually, to me, seems like a relatively clear case.
Several people commented to me during the past week that your remarks about being hoisted upon their own petard, quoting Shakespeare in this, was very erudite, more than we are normally accustomed to on this show. So, John.
Does that mean I can quote Monty Python? Are we establishing a baseline?
Andy Griffith, just run the gamut here.
Because in Monty Python's election night skit, which is famous and everybody should watch it, there's the sensible party versus the silly party. And then there is a very silly party. And I'm afraid in North Carolina, where we are on this dispute and many others, is just the debate between silly and very silly. The 90-day requirement is entirely reasonable and applies to many other offices. It's entirely reasonable to allow someone to require that you do this with, no less than 90 days before you file. The problem, as said earlier, is that wasn't the standard. Well, again, ex post facto is about a criminal matter.
I know, but it's a good comparison,
John. But the concept is that you can't change the rules after the fact. That's the argument. The argument might be on the other side. This has the attempt to mislead the voters. I'm not exactly sure how the appeal is going to go, but you can understand why the plaintiffs feel like they have a good case.
But all of this is really calling into a question the printing of the ballots, because same time this past week, a 3-judge panel, which was appointed to consider the constitutional issues that Governor Cooper and the NAACP and an environmental group had raised, said ixnay on the ballot printing because we want to get this thing decided. Now, here's our Board of Elections, State Board of Elections, and they're sitting over here and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we got to get these ballots printed in order to be able to get the absentee ballots up. September 7th is what they say is the deadline they need, AB. What happens if we don't have decisions on these cases by then?
Then they can't operate on that deadline. There's probably going to be some pushing back, and quite frankly, there's a lot of confusion. And for them to go ahead and hurry up and wait, so to speak, is confusing not only for them but also for voters.
Well, we may hear something today, Tom. I mean, unfortunately, we'll be on television before we know what the court says, but they could make a ruling today.
Friday.
But there presumably will be an appeal by the losing side.
Whatever it happens to be.
Because nothing ever ends anymore. This is, I'm a lawyer. I am glad that every lawyer in North Carolina has a job working on one of these issues, but sometime it's got to stop.
Chris, looking at the comments that were made by the 3-judge panel when the governor's office and the NAACP and so forth came before them, could you get any leaning as to how they might rule in this?
Well, I mean, I think most people took from those comments that they were unlikely to say that this language was unconstitutional or that they would stop these amendments. But there was a couple of people who I thought raised an interesting question. I don't actually know what I think about this, but I do think there has to be some standard. If you say the General Assembly can put anything on the ballot, even if it's the exact opposite of the effect of it, are we going to allow that to happen? I mean, there's some line where the ballot language is so misleading that it could either be unconstitutional or struck down by some other provision. I'm not sure we're at that point.
How's all this going to play out come Election Day, John?
Well, I think that for most voters in North Carolina, they will hear about or be confronted with the ballot language related to the constitutional amendments for the first time when they go into the ballot box. I don't think they will know a whole lot of the backstory. Some of them will hear pitches from either side about it. I still think a lot of these amendments as they are written, maybe almost all of them, are likely to pass. So the people who don't like these amendments, and I have questions about a couple of them myself, or opposed definitely to one of them, I think that they see this court challenge as the way to stop it. But as Chris is getting at, I'm not sure from the conversation, the hearing, the presentation, I'm not sure there's a clear case, at least on these amendments at this time, that the court can or should intervene, really has the power to intervene on this matter where it is, the argument is not so much that it is a blatant lie, but it leave things out, there's ambiguity. That's a standard that I'm not sure we want to get the court to start applying, because that could end some bad places.
What if it was a blatant lie? They still, under the Constitution,
that's a good question.
I mean, they have the right to put things on the ballot. Nobody disputes the General Assembly can put constitutional amendments on the ballot. So the question is, what if there were even a far more extreme version? I think this is a misleading amendment, a couple of them, but what if they were a blatant lie? Then what happens? And is it constitutional to say you can't do that? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, that's the issue here is that all three branches of government have supposedly separate constitutional authority. All three of them in North Carolina derive their power from the people as voters.
Right.
And so the argument would be, from the legislative side, this is ultimately a political question. If the legislature does something the public doesn't like, the public can, diselect the legislature.
Yeah,
that would be
when
the
you
argument.
enshrine something in the Constitution, the burden of getting it back out again is almost impossible. And when you say the part of the Constitution is unconstitutional, then you're starting to talk nonsense.
Well, you can't do that.
I think the wording on most of these amendments is so vague that it could present a problem for people actually knowing what they're doing.
Now, we had the 5 governors in North Carolina who came together in opposition to these constitutional amendments. Two of the constitutional amendments. Yeah. And we're going to talk about that next week. And next week, by the way, just to sort of tease you a little bit, we've got former Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr and former Attorney General Rufus Edmisten going to be on the show joining our panel to discuss about this. Let's shift from the courtroom for a second over to the examination room. In order to save cost and improve health for our Medicaid recipients, our legislature passed reforms in 2015 that would begin to shift from a fee-for-service to managed care for patients. Now, this past week, the Department of Health and Human Services issued requests for proposals for 4 insurance companies or health providers statewide and another 6 to 10 regional contracts to manage the 1.6 million North Carolina Medicaid patients. Peg, these could be the largest contracts ever issued by the state. We're told it could amount to $6 billion per year. You spent a lot of your time with healthcare issues. From what you've studied, how well have DHHS Secretary Mandy Cohen, Medicaid Director Dave Richard, and the staff done in preparing for this transition?
Well, Tom, I think that they have actually done as good a job as people can humanly do in a change that is so great as this. Secretary Cohen has been open throughout the entire process. They have issued a series of position papers that then they took public comment and they reissued the position papers on how this whole new scheme will look. That has been something that was never done under a major change like this. The secretary and her folks have met with providers and health insurance entities from across the country and across the state. They have gone to other states to see what has worked and what has not worked. They brought in some of the best consultants, and they're constantly taking feedback from stakeholders and the public. And I think, to Secretary Cohen's credit, she's working as transparently with the legislature as she possibly can.
Yeah, she's getting along pretty well with them, and I think they respect her for what she's doing.
I think they do, and as far as what can be done when you're making such a big change, I think they've done everything they possibly can.
Yeah, make no mistake about it, John. This is the biggest change in health care that we've seen since Medicaid and Medicare were originally formed. And I think it's fair to ask the question right now, do we really need to make this big change? Go back and remember, the atmosphere in 2015, we were having huge budget deficits at the end of every year on our Medicaid program. The legislature tightened up the way they were budgeting. The DHHS tightened up the management of these programs. Do we still need these Medicaid reforms?
I think that going to a system of contracts and having the provider networks, the insurance networks have some sort of skin in the game, have a managed care type approach is inevitable. It is actually the standard practice in most of the country. I think North Carolina is going to implement that. I think they wisely should implement that. And in fact, this was a big partisan dispute 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I sense today there is more of a sense of let's make this work properly, which I believe is the wise choice.
Chris, do we know of any states that have gone to this managed care kind of thing that have done it successfully?
Well, I think there are examples around the country of states that have done it well and states that have done it poorly. I'm still not sure it is the best way to go, but I do agree that it's happening and it's going to happen. I think it's worth noting, for all the bashing of the Cooper administration, that we've had in the past. As Peg mentioned, it's been a very transparent process. The current state Medicaid director, remember, was the Medicaid director under Governor McCrory. So in some ways, you could argue this is sort of a bipartisan department now at the top. I'm not wild about the idea, but I do think it's being implemented the best way that we can to serve the patients, which is the ultimate goal.
Anna Beavon, as we said, this is going to be the largest contract the state has ever issued. They want these RFPs due by October 12th this fall. And then they're going to review the applications, and they want to award the 4 statewide and the 6 to 10 regional contracts by early February. This is a pretty aggressive, ambitious schedule.
It is an aggressive timeline. I'm looking forward to seeing that happen. I mean, we've discussed that it is definitely a reality and very much like a train moving that can't be stopped. But that timeline is aggressive, and I look forward to seeing what happens.
Well, you know, Tom, if I can add one thing. While all this is going on, we have not yet gotten the approval from CMS on our Medicaid waivers. So, but you know, the promises have been made that this transition is going to take, or this transformation is going to take place. So that's, you know, that's one of the things that could derail the train. And you know, and I think Secretary Cohen, she's so committed to buying not just cheaper health care, but actually buying health for North Carolina, better health, that, you know, I think this has got to happen.
Does it help that she came out of CMS? I mean,
because it does absolutely help. Yes. She knows from the other side, for example, the questions about approving of waivers and what's a green flag, what's a red flag. She knows a lot based on her federal experience and now her state experience. But again, it's not just her. There's a variety of people involved in this, from the legislators who have schooled up on the issue, the providers who know this is coming and are trying to adjust to it. Remember that Community Cares in North Carolina was supposed to be the enemy against which the Republicans were maneuvering, but it's not ended up being the way it's turned out.
No, they're an ally.
They're part of the process. So I think that this is actually, sometimes we talk about all the things that are going wrong in North Carolina, the unbridgeable divides, the big fights that are going on, and that's good because that gives NC Spin something to talk about. But this is a case where people are working together, I think, effectively so far on a very important matter that has the potential to save taxpayer money and improve health care.
I think you raise a very valid point, because too often times on this show we are criticizing something that was done or has taken place in the state or various agencies or parties or whatever. And I think, I forget who said it, whether it was John or Peg, once people decided that managed care was going to be the way we went with Medicaid, everybody has just sort of pitched in and said, okay, let's make it work the best we can. And I think that's a very good thing. All right, so do we really think that we can begin rolling this out in 2019 or early 2020 is actually what they are projecting? Pretty ambitious schedule.
Well, you know, I think part of the thing that we need to talk about is that there's a phase-in approach. So not the entire Medicaid population isn't going to switch over to managed care on day one. So there will be staging, which will help work out bugs as things go forward. But unless CMS just says absolutely no, it looks like it's a go.
Dave Richards and Secretary Cohen have just been constantly in contact with the folks up there. And my understanding is that there's still a few things to be ironed out, but they're not major. Let's switch gears again. Following a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision, online retailers who sell to North Carolinians could be required to collect sales taxes and pay them to the state. The Cooper administration appeared ready to implement this new authority, but some questions have been raised as to whether or not the state can do so without legislative permission. John Hood, you talked about this last week on the show. Help us understand the confusion as to whether or not the legislature has got to pass authorization.
Well, it would take a long time to explain all the arguments and counter-arguments, but essentially the
Take as much time as you
Thank
like.
you very much. I appreciate
we end
that.
at 8
okay.
o'clock.
I got it. The legislature had a bill filed it passed one chamber but not the other, that would authorize the state explicitly to collect sales tax on these online transactions and to meet certain thresholds that were really the standard in South Dakota that was upheld by the Supreme Court. So I guess at least a lot of legislators thought they needed to pass a bill in order to do it. The bill didn't pass, but Governor Cooper wants to do it anyway. Their argument is there's pre-existing legislation that justifies this. That's at least ambiguous. I won't get into the details of that. I think that their argument is very odd, but they seem to believe it. But no one could seriously argue that the thresholds that the governor has announced for how many sales do you have to make in order to be required to render sales tax, none of that has been enacted ever by the legislature. It ought to be. And look, the legislature's coming back at a special session right after the election. They'll be back in early 2019. Surely this can wait for the legislature to act, because it is a legislative power, speaking of separation of powers, to enact tax legislation. I just don't see this as a necessary debate. Just let the legislature authorize it.
Governor Cooper says no. In fact, the Department of Revenue says they have the authority to be able to do it.
Well, the Department of Revenue sets tax policy and they interpret tax policy. They've had that authority. I think their governor is arguing they can do that in this case, but I think we're sort of, this is the battle, because we like to talk about separation of powers. The real issue will be what will happen to the legislation. If this was already a good idea, the Republican General Assembly refused to pass this. In other places, this has been attacked by some conservative folks as a tax increase. And I think you might see that rhetoric happen in 2019.
I think you might see it at this table.
Well, I mean,
we're going to, and I'm going to get to that.
Well, I mean, that's the interesting part about it. That's what this is really all about, is whether or not charging the same people when you buy a book online and you buy a book at the bookstore, should you have to pay the sales tax on that book?
This is about whether that should be a net tax increase. You could do this and then reduce the rate so it's revenue neutral. That wouldn't be a tax increase.
No, that's not really what it's about. It's about who passes tax law. Who gets is it the legislature or is it
but the ultimate, what they're going to get into is whether or not it's a tax increase.
Well, but on that respect, I agree with John Hood.
Is there any question we're not going to do this? I mean, the North Carolina retail merchants, among others, have said, hey, look, these online merchants have an unfair advantage on us because we're having to collect the sales tax and they aren't. Yeah. This levels the playing field. Is that legitimate?
Absolutely. And I think it provides a really interesting opportunity to lower the rate overall so that it puts everybody on the same playing field, but also lowers the rate.
All right, so here's the $1 million, actually $400 million question that might be raised. And John, you wrote a column on this a week or so ago. Presuming that we think we know what's going to happen, it could mean as much as $400 million a year additional revenue to the state of North Carolina. Now, what happens to that $400 million? Do we put it in rainy day funds? Do we use it to increase programs like for education or whatever like that? John, your concept was interesting.
Well, just make it revenue neutral. I understand the argument about fairness. The Supreme Court has said you can do this now. So expand the base of sales tax, lower the rate, keep it from being a tax increase. That's simple.
You said send it back to the people.
Well, it reduces if you reduce the tax rate, then you're making it revenue neutral.
At a time when our per capita spending on education is lower than it was before the Great Recession, and people are already buying these books and have to pay the same they would at their local store, I think at the very least some of this money should be invested in things to help people, and not, we've already given $3.5 billion worth of tax relief. Maybe we should finally make some investments.
All right. Let's switch over again and ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Peg O'Connell, tell us something we don't know.
So I'm trying to decide bad or good. I'm going to tell you something good. So in the middle of the summer, 90 fire departments led by the Office of State Fire Marshal within the Department of Insurance canvassed statewide for houses without smoke detectors and installed 3,600 smoke detectors for free in places that did not have the protection.
Interesting. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
North Carolina's ABC Commission, which among other things operates a monopoly of liquor stores, is under fire. There's been an audit that was questioned, millions of dollars of spending. There's confusion about who's responsible for it. There's a lot of more stories to break. I think this will push a major effort towards at least changing the oversight of the ABC Commission. Of course, I'd like to privatize the system.
Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
One thing that hadn't been discussed too much and just came out in discussion this past week about the constitutional amendments on the ballot is that they're not numbered for the first time. When we've had multiple amendments on the ballot before, it's been listed. The First Amendment is X, First Amendment is Y. The General Assembly forbid the amendments from being numbered. The theory is they don't want to campaign against the, let's say, the two that John opposes, saying vote against Amendment 4 or vote no on 4. So they literally won't allow the amendments to be numbered, which is insane.
And we've got more amendments on the ballot than we've ever had since 1971 when we revised the Constitution. Anna Beavon, tell us something we don't know.
Bloomberg reported earlier this week that sales in the food industry has increased, has had the largest 3-month surge since 1992, which comes to 25.3 annualized gains. And a lot of people are speculating that's because of the Trump tax cuts.
Really?
Yeah.
And this is from Bloomberg?
It is.
Interesting. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. By the way, you can sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, Spin Cycle, while you're there. Join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.